Thank you, everybody. I have a namesake who many of you know, who did write Death and Life of Great American Cities. So in my career, because I also talk about cities, I've become an expert in what Wikipedia called disambiguation, which is, you know, if you look up Jane Jacobs, there's the Death and Life of Great American Cities, Jane Jacobs, and then there's me. So I'm very pleased to be here, and thank you everyone for the invitation and for accommodating the fact that I have to leave on Friday and so needed to speak today. I want to talk in a different register altogether to our previous speakers, Franz and Mark. And I think Franz and Mark are doing fantastic work. I'm in complete awe of the scale, ambition, but also the ethic of care and partnership with which they are proceeding to do that work. And what I'm going to talk about today is started off big like that. Big vision, big building, big master plan, big problem. And I want to talk about the long and quite glum afterlife of that big vision. Now, I have no doubt that Franz and Mark are proceeding with their work in such a way that the partnership work, the sensitivity to local conditions, to a wider economy of architecture in society, in economy, will mean that their efforts will not share the kind of story that I'm going to tell now. But it is true that many architectural visions end not where they wanted to be. And it is certainly true that cities, and especially cities embedded in a capitalist framework, are sites of creative destruction. So that we have cycles of obsolescence, destruction, demolition, and regeneration, rebuilding happening all the time. And I want to tell a story of housing obsolescence, an idea, a powerful architectural idea that has become, at least in the context of Europe, essentially obsolete, although it lives on in other places and other times. This is, I'm just going to test my, I think this is the story of the residential high-rise, and in particular the state-funded high-rise. Now, I do not want to talk about the residential high-rise in the same vein as my very famous and much respected namesake, Jane Jacobs of Death and Life of Great American Cities would have. I'm not bringing the high-rise into the room in order to make a case for its counter form of housing, as she might have. Nor am I wanting to bring it into the room as Charles Jenks might have, as a kind of marker of the end of modernism and the beginning of postmodernism. I don't want to do either of those two things, which are both true and not true. What I want to do is to focus on the fact that many cities live on with this kind of housing and make do with them and are having to make decisions around them. One of those decisions is demolition, and I want to tell that story. I also want to talk a little bit about the fact that with the end of a building, it's hard for architecture to find a place in that story unless it's a place called regeneration. And then, of course, it's not the end of the building, it's a new life. And myself, working with Stephen Cairns, who will speak at another point in time, and Ignace Strebel, who was our postdoc in a project around residential high-rise and who is at ETH, we're involved in thinking about how architecture and other disciplines, because I'm a geographer, can intervene in and have something to say at the moment that a building ends. And that architectural point of conversation is not simply to build something new, although it, well, indeed, could be and will be. This is block 153-183-213 Peters Hill Drive, Glasgow, which is a 26 to 28 storey slab block containing about 312 flats. It's just one block in a wider estate called Red Road that was designed by the architect Sam Bunton in the early 1960s and comprised 6 31-storey point blocks and these 2 so-called slab blocks. And the entire estate, when it was running, was provided over 1,000 dwellings. It was, when it was first built, the tallest residential housing estate in Europe. It was opened in October 28, 1966 by the then Secretary of State for Scotland, William Ross. And as this slide shows, the estate was yet to be completed when it was opened, which gives you a sense of the kind of anticipation and enthusiasm that was around the block. They opened it before it was completed, and at the opening, William Ross said, "Let's get on with it. Put everything you have into the completion of these blocks. Remember what it's for. It's for all the ordinary people. It's your job," he's talking to the workers, "it's your job to give them decent homes." And that kind of ethos of care, of enthusiasm, and is very much about what we capture when we think about future cities and the kind of opportunities of envisioning new architectural futures. And the entire estate, of course, was one articulation of that kind of post-war enthusiasm for city rebuilding and big planning, a big state, supported by technological innovation in architecture and design. And here we have a kind of middling modernism, of course. We're a long way from Le Corbusier's vision here, but it was this middling modernism that got taken up into bureaucratic systems of housing provision. It was a steel-framed building that Sam Bunton, the architect, designed, and this was the only steel-framed high-rise residential building in Britain ever built. Everything else was steel-reinforced concrete. The vision for a steel building was very much enhanced by the steel industry, which was supporting Sam Bunton, and which in the context of Glasgow was very powerful. Glasgow, of course, was shipbuilding, steel producing area post-war. So it had a lot of steel workers, and not enough demand for its product. The vision that Sam Bunton had was to build like this in steel and to produce something flexible. He imagined that his steel frame would live on, the cladding would come off, and the building would be reclad and regenerated variously across time as trends in building fabrics changed, as taste changed, as requirements demanded. What ended up happening, of course, was, because it's the British welfare state, which was, of course, under-resourced, is that there was one phase of redevelopment when the lifts were regenerated and some circulation systems were changed. But by and large, it became a residual estate, and like many such estates, was the subject of various social sciences which deemed high-rise living to be inappropriate living for families. Here we have Pearl Jeffcott's study of Red Road, of actually another Glasgow flat, where she's saying, well, look, where's the view that the architects promised us, and you can only get it if you take a shot somewhere up near the ceiling. So that kind of ground truthing of architectural aspirations and claims was very common, and really resulted in the kind of fate that Red Road suffered, which is disinvestment, residualisation, stigmatisation. And in 2004, many of the flats were empty. Nobody wanted to live there, not even the poorest of the poor. It was largely used for emergency housing, for asylum seekers and refugees, and a few of the original aged residents who were holding on to their home. At that very point in time, the government deemed it to be unviable and unable to be upgraded and or privatised. It's very important to understand what an unviable decision means. The root word means viability has the same root as vitality. So when something is called unviable, it literally means it is no longer capable of life, of supporting life. Then came a very predictable redevelopment process, stage 1 of which was decanting and relocating tenants. Stage 2, the preparation for demolition and the demolition itself, which will be completed by about 2017. And stage 3 is a non-high-rise housing redevelopment scheme. So on the 10th of June 2012, not long ago, Alex Maguire from Glasgow Housing Association pushed the button and the first of the Red Road blocks came down. The Red Road blocks, he said, were popular in their day and are known around the world, but their time has come to an end, says the government official. We are pleased the demolition of the first of the Red Road blocks went according to plan. We want to think about a general economy of architecture. So we've been trying to think about how can architecture understand itself in an economy that is more than simply about design, but sees the whole life cycle of a building. And the Red Road story for us stands as an emblem of how not to think about architecture, not simply because it was failed typology, but simply because even though the architect imagined it would rejuvenate itself, somehow it wasn't able to sustain that story, that original vision of the architect. We approached Red Road deliberately because it was a building in its unmaking. And we wanted to think about the ways in which buildings fell out of value, all kinds of value, economic value, symbolic value, use value, etc. So how did Red Road become rubble, and how can we tell the story of the unmaking of Red Road? It is, of course, a devaluation story, but a very interesting one in and of itself, and I'll just briefly talk about that before I go on to the main focus of what I want to talk about. The reason that Red Road became unviable was because much of the material, because it was a steel-framed building, was asbestos. And asbestos was simply too expensive. It produced such a high-risk material for regeneration of that building, alongside of the fact that that typology had fallen out of style, that increasingly Red Road became out of sync with a whole set of value systems, one of which, of course, was new standards for livability. That is, the standards for fuel security and for fuel efficiency. None of the windows in Red Road could be renewed. Residents are still living with steel-frame windows, single-glazed, that have not been replaced since the day the building was built. And so clearly is a complete burden for the state, and it means that the housing authorities cannot reconcile the building stock that they have with this kind of new sustainable agendas that are coming in place. So very interestingly, this case of obsolescence is a direct result of changing standards to do with fuel security and livability. Something's going on. This is just the asbestos, of course. I won't go into that quote there. It is an obsolete building, but like many buildings that have served as homes, regardless of its quality, it is not unloved. And indeed, when the announcement came that it was to be demolished, housing activists and residents alike were variously engaged in certain kinds of resistances and/or actions to support the decision to get rid of the building.
Structural sound. I love 29 upload to what My next door neighbour's right there in front of me.
I'm in 1, 2, 3 as well.
I'm 29 up. I had an inspector out there like construction, and he told me that the blocks from that structure was in radically structural damage. My house suffers for it. I mean, you see the cracks in the walls opening and closing with winds, the high winds. What I was told was, don't paint the walls, put up wallpaper and hide it. And they came out with boxes of popper colour. As I said, I didn't think we'd like what I'm going to say, but I think it's honest.
I can appreciate and sympathise with the problems we've got.
Don't get it wrong, I do my part, spend a fortune with my part up and all my funds. But at the same time, I can't afford to dedicate every year because these walls are open up.
So here we have the ambivalent space of a resident who both loves a flat and is routinely decorating it and wallpapering it in the context of a failed architectural infrastructure. I've got many more quotes that I could show you, but I won't. I won't read them out to you. But one of the key things was the issue about the asbestos, which meant that residents couldn't change their flats. They could barely put up a picture, and doing anything around the window was of high risk to them. So these are just various quotes, saying we wanted new windows, but we couldn't have them. So these are people who live with obsolescence in a very elongated time frame. And again, just another example of this. So we have something called SafeDem, who comes in as the company in partnership with the Glasgow Housing Association and the Red Road Ballonock Housing Authority, and in 2008 begin the process of demolishing Red Road. They do all the things that are needed, and in particular they had to be very careful about asbestos, because in the demolition process it couldn't just be a blowdown. They had to strip out all the asbestos to reduce the effects in the final blowdown that did happen. And of course this was a public relations exercise of quite extensive effort. Wasted but not waste. One of the things that we found ourselves doing when we were recording a building that was coming down is that we started off being involved in a building that no one seemed to be interested in, everyone wanted to get rid of. And by the third year of our research, everyone was fully nostalgic about. How do we intervene in that? What has architecture got to say and do in relation to that? The Red Road flats, a whole set of authorities generated something called the Red Road Legacy Project. Involved museums, it involved housing authorities, and it involved us and what was by then a very extensive archive of film, of the concierge service at work, residents talking about their flats and showing us their flats. And we became engaged in a process we called that was the production of something called Red Road in a Box. It involved Swal Wei Lee, myself, Stephen Cairns, Ignace Threble, and Crawford McGugan, who was from the museums. It was a project that was, excuse me, I don't know why it's got blue on it, a project that was about knowledge transfer, embedding our digital archive of interviews and film, video into something that was not technology-based, high-tech based. It had to be low-tech, and it had to serve this interest in the Red Road as a site of memory and lives that had been lived, how to produce a legacy. So our question became, how could architecture contribute to the end of the life of a building? This is the brief we had from the museum. Produce something called a handling box. Museums nowadays accept people in, but they want to take their collections out to the world. And one of the mechanisms they do this with, or the technologies they use, is something called the handling box, which is an easily movable box containing information and artefacts from the museum collection. Obviously not fully valuable ones, but ones that can nonetheless tell a story. This is the one that was made by the Glasgow Museums itself. It's got documents and it's got a little power box pulled out of Red Road that people would have used there. This comes from a tradition of box making, which is similar to the GI footlocker, which is, of course, the box that the GI, the military servicemen would have at the end of their bunk, and in which all their goods and chattels would live. This is an example of one of those GI footlockers in use, obviously from a particular era, given the pin-up girl at the back. And we thought this is a good model for a box, but as architects and people involved in digital media and sociological investigation into the life of the flat, we wondered what else we could offer. And in thinking that through, we went back to the architectural point of model making. And of course, model making in architecture almost always happens at the beginning of the building. It's there to illustrate what will become into being. It's used rhetorically, of course, for its persuasive power, so one can envisage a life to be led in the model. And here's just two very different examples of an architectural model at work. In the high-rise history, the model has had a very particular trajectory and utility. Here's Le Corbusier's famous hand, photographed in the late 1940s, early 50s for his Marseille Unité de Habitation in Marseille. And here you have the idea of the wine rack principle. Tay Ken Soon quotes him in 1990 when he develops his low-cost, high-rise plug-in housing. And so you can see that the high-rise produces certain kind of modelling opportunities that other typologies don't. So what do we do as architects and geographers and filmmakers in thinking through this, and how do we proceed? We started by doing, and Stephen Cairns was very important in this, doing a lineage of boxes across different kinds of media and expressive fields. And for example, within art practice, here's Joseph Cornell's boxes, where he is collecting found objects and placing them into a box arrangement and presenting it back as an art object. And of course, in a building that's coming down, it's full of found objects, and one of our techniques was actually a kind of gleaning exercise where we'd go into emptied flats with permission and collect what had been left behind and record the abandoned or vacated apartment. This is just more of Joseph Cornell's work, again, using found objects and putting them into a box format. And there's something quite suggestive here about the display format, and you can see that will come back into our own thinking. A second artist whose work inspired us was Louise Nevelson's work, again thinking about found objects represented here in a high relief, monochromatic, expressive form, and again producing boxes which, again, she works as a gleaner. She would often just take things from the streets of New York and put them into this box form and produce an artifact. This is at a slightly different scale, a much broader sweep. Not canvas, but obviously her boxes all put together into a larger scale. So we thought we liked the found objectness of this, we liked the texture, we liked the boxness of all of this, but we also had to think about practicalities, and we turned to this box, which is of course the travelling trunk, the portmanteau, as the final kind of box inspiration for our project of how architecture might intervene at the end of the life of this building. This is Wei Li, who started to work, she's a PhD student at University of Edinburgh, who started to work with Stephen specifically, and myself and Ignace as content providers and advisors in producing a mock-up of what we might be doing. We had various knowledge transfer moments when the technology group from Glasgow Museums came through to the University of Edinburgh architecture workshop and learnt about laser cutting and laser printing. And so we did a set of technology transfer moments which were important for their technicians because they were not using any of this kind of stuff. These are just shots of the box in production. And you can see we made some very bold decisions. For a start, we made our box Red Road building. So this is the exterior of the box is in fact the exterior of Red Road, etched with a laser cut. And this is the interior of the box, which is full of objects which have been produced using our digital archive. So all of our filmed interviews, all of the filmed ethnography with the concierge service, various other archival photographs were put into the box. All of that would have been very easy to access through a computer, but no museum wants to have an IT-based system. When they're talking about this, they want a low-tech system. So everything had to be hardware, if you like. We took interviews with residents about their views and their windows and produced these hand objects that could be handled and pulled out, little plates, wooden plates with the quote etched in and the visual as a kind of slide that could be held up and handled. And we'd have whole sequences of residents discussing their views and talking about the history of the building. We took we did fold out three-dimensional images of vacated flats, and we took them and they were reconstituted as rooms that could be pulled out and looked into as boxes. And then the box itself is with the museum and is borrowed out to different people. This, for example, was Glasgow has something called, many British cities do, something called an Open Doors Day, where you can go into buildings of note as a member of the public. And at the Red Road Open Doors Day, which was prior to the demolition, they took the box, Red Road in a box, and had it on display. And it's this is just an image of how people handle and use the box in various ways. So what we wanted to do and what this project, which was really one that we hadn't planned to do, we were asked to do, has made us really start to think about how architecture exists in relation to moments where unbuilding happens. Instead of it simply coming in as the new architecture to replace the old, what skill sets from architecture can go into this process of legacy, this process of memory work that needs to go on in and around the end of a building. Thank you.
Would you like to take a few questions?
Yes, I'm happy to take questions.
Right. We'll have a few questions before we go to the next speaker. So any questions for Jane?
Thank you, Jane, for this fascination of the end of a building. Has that become a more adopted procedure by now in different parts of the cities that are shrinking or whose buildings need to be demolished? Because it's such a striking other end of what we just saw before, buildings being constructed with very, very delicate means, and then you preparing the end of them. This is really quite fascinating.
I think our project would fall into the category of use that is happening in all shrinking cities where there's wide-scale obsolescence and where there's a pause between the building becoming obsolete and new use, either through regeneration and or demolition and rebuilding. Those kinds of so-called obsolete spaces produce a whole range of use opportunities. And so you find artists who occupy those places. Obviously there's the squatters who do it. So our project, if you like, is in a continuum with a whole range of activities that utilise architectures that are in paused between one use and another. And I think that they offer us very useful moments for reflection around, because in a way it's another kind of expertise that comes in at that point. Different kinds of expertise, different kinds of notions of design, because this is all about users taking over and remaking as they will.
That's great. And any more questions? Okay, if not, we'll thank Jane for this really wonderful and fascinating presentation, and thank you very much.